Does business and philosophy go together? Does philosophy and business go together? Is philosophy evil? Is business evil? Is evil philosophy? Is evil business? The first time I ever taught business writing class, I got one of the more interesting teaching evaluations I've ever had, still to this day, where the evaluator said, "This course is anti-constitutional because it teaches about business writing, but it talks about business as if it's in the context of larger organizations. However, America is the land of free enterprise, and free enterprise means working by yourself, working for yourself, and not working for other people. So by talking about working within larger organizations, this class violates the main principles of the Constitution." I've been thinking about that one for a long time. It has made me think about what my conceptions of business are, what my expectations of the business careers of my students are, and what are the best ways to think about this stuff. But it's also made me think, am I pushing my own point of view on people? And if so, I must be doing a really bad job if that's the conclusion. But let's talk about that one for a little bit. The word indoctrination gets thrown around a lot in our political climate, so it's something that we should examine a little bit before we get into our readings. I think it's important. Are you indoctrinating someone into a point of view if you simply do your best to expose it to them? Are you indoctrinating someone into a point of view if you do your best to point out all possible angles of it? If you do your best to point out benefits, if you do your best to point out logical flaws, I think that the really best way to proceed in any of these cases is to cast a wide net as possible, learn as much about as many different points of view as possible and every angle of each point of view, and then you can get a good grasp on what you really believe. But if you don't question things, you really can't do that. Now, we're in a little bit of an interesting situation because we're in a business writing course, and business writing courses, by their very nature, tend to take the perspective of business people. So what does it mean to be a businessman? How does this tie into the things we're supposed to be talking about in this class? Well, a critical thinker is going to have to question all of the assumptions underlying this if we want to understand it at all. Questioning assumptions is very much at the heart of how you need to proceed in a lot of cases. Yeah, we're business writing, but still, we don't all look at things the same, nor should we. So, with that in mind, let's talk about why businessmen need philosophy. The title tends to throw people an awful lot right away because philosophy and business seem to be opposites in a lot of ways. But this author, to his credit, does say that you need to be able to incorporate them both together. So, how well does this author incorporate philosophy? Let's look at a few quotes. "Business, to a creative man, is his life. His life is not the social results of the work, but the work itself, the actual job, the thought, the blueprints, the decisions, the deals, the action. Creativity is inherently selfish. Productivity is inherently selfish." Now, the thing about this quote is it's not unique to this author, nor is it the kind of thought that has only shown up in the last X number of years. Back in the 80s, there was a film called Wall Street that examined how this attitude pervaded high-end business culture. I'm going to play you just a tiny, tiny quote from it.
"The new law of evolution in corporate America seems to be survival of the unfittest. Well, in my book, you either do it right or you get eliminated. In the last 7 deals that I've been involved with, there were 2.5 million stockholders who have made a pre-tax profit of $12 billion. Thank you. I am not a destroyer of companies. I am a liberator of them. The point is, ladies and gentlemen, that greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. Greed works. Greed clarifies, cuts through, and captures the essence of the evolutionary spirit. Greed in all of its forms. Greed for life, for money, for love, knowledge, has marked the upward surge of mankind, and greed, you mark my words, will not only save Teldar paper, but that other malfunctioning corporation called the USA. Thank you very much.
It's important to know, though, that the main character, played by Michael Douglas, is a corporate raider. It's his job to buy companies, gut them, sell them, and steal as much money from their corpse as humanly possible. And Michael Douglas does a good enough job of doing this speech and presenting his character where it's easy to forget he's a villain. Let's take just the text of the quote at its words. Greed is good. Greed is the way to do stuff. To my mind, that brings up the question why. Not why greed is good. I understand why people would want as much money as humanly possible. But if greed is good, if greed works, that doesn't explain why people don't pursue greed. Why would someone dedicate their life to charity or to making their life better, to making someone else's life better? Why would someone dedicate themselves to service, to their fellow soldiers or to their country? Why would anyone be a teacher? Why would anyone be an artist? The thing with the original quote, both from the article we're reading and from the movie clip, is if greed is good and if greed works, it means that anyone who does any of these other jobs must be an idiot. Hold on to that thought. Is that something you like? Is that something you buy into? Another quote. Either a man cares about the process of production or he does not. If he cares about the process, it must be his primary concern, not the beneficiaries of the process, but the personal fulfillment inherent in his own productive activity. If he does not care about it, then he cannot produce. Now, what I want to do with this quote is take a slightly different angle and examine not what he says or implications, but I want to try to work towards figuring out how this writer thinks. What system is at work? You can produce or you cannot produce. Production has to be your life or you're going to fail at it. Seems like this author subscribes to a level of thinking where things are either one thing or they're the other. When you're looking for a path forward, you can either succeed or you can fail. This is a method of thought which leads itself to clear and easy answers. And we can point this out by playing a little game of I say, you say. If I say left, the natural response would be to say right. If I say up, down. Male, female. Yes, no. Right, wrong. It's either one thing or the other. You can't have in-betweens when you start to think like this. Now, I know that the way we think about gender, sexuality, and such makes the male-female thing not as quite cut and dry as it's either one or the other. But bear with me. I'm not saying this is true. I'm saying this is one way to think. If you are the person who likes to divide the world in half, then you're someone who believes in binary oppositions. The term comes from the computer industry. Actually it comes from mathematics, but computers at their root work on breaking down problems into either it's this or it isn't. It's one thing or the other. And they even run deep at the deepest level of programming, go through the programming to what actually happens in the computer, They operate by breaking things down just that. You do this or you do this. You do this or you do this. And they use binary numbers, where everything can be represented by either a 0 or a 1. That's the original, well, it's one of the original definitions of binary. People have taken the binary opposition thing and extended the metaphor away from mathematics to other things. Claude Lévi-Strauss, one of the more infamous linguists, puts this towards the reading of culture and literature and talks about narrative oppositions. Age is opposed to youth. It's either one or the other. Police are opposed to criminals. The future is opposed to the past. So on and so forth. Now, breaking down something to either it's this or this will allow you to be able to, if you have the language to express it, still make very, very intricate computations. Not only in terms of stuff that normal computers do. This is the Harvard Mark I, a computer that existed before microprocessors. And they existed a long time before that, too. But if you can express your thoughts in enough intricacy and detail, you can use binary oppositions to get relatively complex answers. And some stupid jokes. No one ever gets this. It's not the only way to think of it's either this or this level of thinking. There's another term that gets used, Manichaeism. It's a theological term, which refers to the idea of absolute good or absolute evil. Originally, I believe this came from a Zoroastrian religion, but theology in general will talk about stuff in Manichaeism terms. Absolute good, absolute evil. You're either doing the work of God or you might as well be working for the devil. If you're not doing the work of the Supreme Being, you might as well be doing Satan's work, because there's no real difference. It's either this or this. It takes the standard binary oppositions we talked about before and puts a moral obligation on one side. It's not just one side or the other. It's one side or the other, but our side is the good side and the other side is the bad side. Now, I know what you're thinking. This sounds like it's relatively simplistic, and surely people don't really think like this anymore. Well, then President George W. Bush, in the wake of 9/11, said, freedom and fear are at war. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists. So unless you do whatever the government wants in order to fight terrorists, you might as well be helping them out. It's a pure binary opposition way of thinking. It's still a very active way of looking at the world, and lots of people do. Let's apply it to what we're talking about, because the article we're talking about says you have to make production your entire life. If you don't, you can't produce, which would seem to, based on our previous examples, set up a real opposition: selfishness versus altruism. The person who dedicates their life to charity cannot produce. You have to be selfish to produce. How do we feel about that? This is where the philosophy comes in. This is where the ethics come in. It's not just a way of looking at the world, it's a way of looking at the world that has consequences for the people around us. If we want to look at the world in a more sophisticated way, that it's either this or this, we can start to look at stuff as a continuum. Not just one response or another, but there's a range of possibilities amongst them. And this seems, at least to my eyes, and the eyes of a lot of philosophers and a lot of people, to be a more realistic way of looking at the world. Very rarely are we ever set with it's either this or this choice. There are usually a range of possible options, and we can arrange them in a way which still establishes some level of order on them. Is one way of working necessarily better than the others? If you're motivated in an instrumental way, it means you work towards tangible rewards. I know I need to achieve this, so this is what I'm going to do. If you're motivated in a self-actualized way, you're doing it for the love of learning a new skill. It's a different way of looking at the world than instrumental. Is it a better one? Well, it really depends. Looking at stuff in continuums means you're looking at a more complex world with a lot more factors at work, so judgments such as good or bad get to be a lot harder to make. Continuing on with our article about business and philosophy, let's do one more quote. If you are to succeed in business, you must make decisions using logic. You must deal with objective realities, like them or not. Your life is filled with numbers, balance sheets, cold efficiency, and rational organization. You have to make sense to your employees, to your customers, and to yourself. Rationality above all things. Now, to my mind, this kind of reads like an attempt to justify what the person has just said. You might not like that I'm saying production is the only thing that matters, but it's rational, so therefore, how can you really argue with it? If you want to increase profitability, you have to do everything to increase profitability. And looking at the emotional aspects of it is anti-profitability and anti-business, if you follow the logic. Well, let's follow the logic a little bit. If you're doing everything possible to increase profitability, that means that you're probably going to be paying your workers as little as humanly possible. After all, you really can't be profitable if you're giving everyone else as much money as they want, can you? Profitability means keeping costs as low as humanly possible. Well, what's the effect of doing that? And what's the effect of doing that specifically in terms of workers? If you don't pay anyone anything, if you keep the salaries as low as possible, if you maximize shareholder gains by minimizing expenditures on people, does that have an effect that's going to affect you? Well, there's something called the cycle of poverty. If you pay people as little as humanly possible, they don't have a lot of money. Well, this is a doy obvious, but low family income tends to lead to less access to food, safe water, health care, and school. Less access to food, safe water, health care, and school tends to lead to hunger, poor sanitation, lack of education. Those things lead to fewer work opportunities, disease, malnutrition, death, which itself leads to a depleted and unskilled workforce, unemployment, which leads to low family income, yada, 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 go through the cycle over and over again. If you pay people as little as possible, the economy that you exist in is going to have this huge level of people who are trapped in poverty. Because when you're poor, it's very, very hard to not be poor. There's no class mobility if you're very, very poor, or at least it becomes frightfully hard. I need more recent data, but this is a chart I found in Washington. I believe this is in like 2015. I'll have to look it up, which puts some numbers on it. In Washington, the childhood poverty rate is 19%. That means a lot of people don't have enough food to eat. If you have bad nutrition, bad brain development, which means school is harder and more people will drop out, which depresses the average wage. And at a minimum wage of $9.75, which is still below the national minimum wage as of 2023, you'd have to work 73 hours just to be able to afford a one-bedroom apartment, which means that you're not going to be able to effectively raise a family, which means your children will be born into poverty, which means yada, yada, yada. The cycle of poverty isn't a new thing. And Judge Abella from the Royal Commission on Equality and Employment in 1985, this was in Ontario, I believe, said, while describing the role of poverty in the average environment, said it's not that individuals in the designated groups are inherently unable to achieve equality on their own. It is that the obstacles in their way are so formidable and self-perpetuating that they cannot overcome without intervention. In other words, poor people can't not be poor unless they get help. It is both intolerable and insensitive if we simply wait and hope that barriers will disappear with time. Equality in employment will not happen unless we make it happen. People have to be forced to pay their workers a living wage, was Judge Abella's ultimate judgment on this. Judge Abella's judgment, get it? Ha ha ha. And this seems to really clash on the point of view presented by Leonard Peikoff in Why Businessmen Need Philosophy. Because, according to this article, philosophy says that you just need to maximize profit by pushing production above all. It's more complex than that, but that's one thing it boils down to here. Now, I know what you're thinking. You've just heard me talk about this article and tear into 3 big quotes, hitting all the preconceptions in a way which isn't inherently not that flattering. And there's at least some of you are thinking, ooh, this person must really, really hate big business. Must be saying that big business is inherently evil. Well, that's not the point of view I'm trying to get across now. But if we're examining a fairly standard take on big business that a lot of people still hold, we have to look at all the different aspects of it, all the different angles on it. Is it the only way you should think about business? Does that mean if business people will think like this, that's the only way anyone can think about business, and therefore all business people are evil? I don't think so. I think there's another way to look at the world of big business, which is why the next video you're going to be watching is R. Edward Freeman's Business is About Purpose, a TED Talk, where he tries to give you a different perspective on how business can, should, and does work. And what I want you to do is, after really thinking about why businessmen need philosophy, and after watching and thinking about businesses about purpose, is do a comparison contrast between the two. Which point of view is more convincing to you? Which is representative of mindset that you think is good? Is one more sustainable than the other? And these are fairly deep questions. But it is part of our goal here to not just talk about business writing, but to also talk about how ethics is involved and how you have to think about these things if you want to be successful. Well, so much for why businessmen need philosophy. It's a topic, though, what do we mean by a business, that we're going to be coming back to, because we're going to be watching a TED Talk where we start to think about different possible ways you can go about business. So you don't get to stop thinking about this stuff yet. Sorry, but it'll be worthwhile. See ya.